Morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, An Orientation on the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund Application Pack, part 3 of this webinar series, where we're focusing on your questions and answers. Before we start the webinar, let me request my colleague Bob to introduce to you the technology and how you can listen to this in French.
Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. As you know, we're using Zoom, and thank you for attending. We have translation, simultaneous interpretation set up, so you can either listen in the original English, or you can select at the bottom of the screen the interpretation and choose the French flag and listen to the presentation in French. Just a couple of notes for the presentation. We are recording this, so we will be able to send out a link afterwards if people need it, of the presentation, and also for us so that we can follow up. We will not be doing questions and answers live as we don't have enough time. We will be using, please enter your comments in the chat box, and the team will follow up with responses afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Again, a very warm welcome to everybody from my side. My name is James Wicken, and I'm the head of Global Policy, Advocacy and Innovation at WSSCC, which, as you know, is evolving into the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. And with me today as co-presenters are Carolien van der Voorden and Sarah Churchhill. And let me hand over the mic to Carolien first, and then to Sarah to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everybody. Bonjour à toutes et tous. This is Carolien. I am the head of our technical support unit here at WSSCC, and very happy to be with you for this third webinar. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Bonjour à tous. I'm Sarah Churchhill, and I've been helping with the team on the development of the policies and the guidelines, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today and hope that it's a very informative session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that everyone has now found the channel that they would like to listen to. Once again, if you've just joined, you can use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to listen to this in French. And as Bob mentioned, please do make use of the chat box today. We will be answering questions, but I'm sure there are many, many more questions, and please add those to the chat box, and we will answer them in due course, and I will explain how that works as we go through the webinar. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? So, before we get into today's webinar, I wanted to just remind everyone about the earlier parts of this webinar series and how you can access that. The first part, back at the end of July, focused on the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strategy and key policies. And part 2 focused on the application pack and the various components of that. There are recordings of those available through a YouTube link. I believe these would have been shared with you through the regional managers. If you would like to listen to those again, please do contact your regional managers, and they can also share with you these slide decks. And I will share with you their contact details once again in this presentation. And so here we are at the bottom of the screen today for part 3 of the webinar series, which is around questions from your side and answers to those questions. Next slide, please. So thank you very, very much for sending in questions that have come up in your mind as you read through the policies and strategies and the application pack. We have grouped these and this is the order in which we will go through and answer the questions today. We'll start with questions pertaining to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund policies. And we will then move on to questions around the transition period and timelines. And I will lead us through those two sections. Then hand over to Carolien and Sarah, who will answer the questions that you have posed around parts of the application pack, specifically the Programmatic Guidelines and the application guidelines. And we will say something around the learning agenda for the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund as well. So this is how we plan to go through this during the webinar. Next slide, please. Now, to expand a little bit on how we've organized today's presentation, we will be addressing questions that we have received to date. Some of these questions were posed during the last two webinars in the chat box, and some questions have come in on email afterwards. And we will try to address these and cover the most relevant topics. These questions relate to the new suite of policies that you see on the left of this slide. And a reminder that these policies are now all available in English and in French on the shfund.org website. And some of your questions also relate to the application pack, and you see the three key documents of that pack on the right-hand side of your screen in red. I hope that this pack has reached you by now. This is available for download from the cloud, and the link to that, you can get the link to that through your regional manager contacts. I believe you will frequently in touch with these colleagues, but their names and email addresses for Clara, Hakim and Matthias are on the screen there if you need to contact them and don't have their details. Now, today's webinar, part 3 of the series, does not introduce more new content. Instead, we're going to answer the questions that you've asked. And the reason for doing this is to clarify key points and also to direct you back to places in the policies and the application pack where you can find the information that you're looking for. And in the bottom right hand of the screen, you can see a frequently asked question document. All of the content that we present today, plus questions and answers to just a few more questions that we won't be able to cover within this 1 hour, will all be available in a Word document that we will circulate towards the end of the week. And please don't stop your questions here. If you have new questions, and I'm sure perhaps some new ones will come up to your mind during the webinar today, please continue to ask those either live today in the chat or send them in to us afterwards. And we will be updating this frequently asked question document and circulating new versions. This is a really good way to build up a common shared understanding of these policies, the new strategy, the operating model, and the components of the application pack. Okay, could we move on to the next slide, please? So, with that introduction, let me begin by sharing some of the questions that we received around the SHF policies, beginning with the policy on eligibility and transition. And I'll actually begin with a few questions which just came in recently and aren't on your slide, but allow me to read out both the question and the answer. So the question is, one of the data sources used in the eligibility policy is the percentage of a country's population without access to at least basic level of sanitation. Which data source will the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund recognize? The WHO UNICEF Joint Monitoring Programme or national data sources? The answer to that question is stated in the Eligibility and Transition Policy, where it says that the fund will use the latest available data set from the WHO UNICEF Joint Monitoring Programme in its eligibility determinations. And the reason for referencing this data set is to ensure a consistent methodology across countries when estimating sanitation access. Another question related to determining eligibility is, GNI will be used as one of the factors for eligibility considerations. Will the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on a country's income be taken into consideration? And the answer to that question is that the SHF uses the latest available GNI data published annually by the World Bank. You can find details of the method used in the eligibility policy. The impact of COVID-19 will be captured in these data published by the World Bank in future years. The next question on eligibility, I'd actually like to take question 2 on your screen first, because that relates to eligibility as well. The question is, are all current Global Sanitation Fund countries deemed eligible? And in this transition period, all countries receiving Global Sanitation Fund grants will be invited to apply to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund in 2020. Amongst this group of GSF countries, those countries that are ineligible for SHF funding will be supported with transition funding as outlined in the eligibility and transition policy. The aim of this transition support is to achieve successful progression for countries moving on from donor-supported projects to domestic funded sanitation and hygiene systems. Now, the top question on your screen, question 1, also relates to transition elements. And the question that we received was, how will the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund plan for countries that will no longer be eligible for the SHF? Is there a phase-out plan envisaged? Now, again, I would refer you to the eligibility and transition policy, where it states that the SHF will support countries to prepare for successful transitions from SHF funding once they are no longer eligible for SHF support. Countries will be granted transition funding for up to 1 allocation period upon becoming ineligible for SHF. Upon becoming ineligible. And SHF will work particularly closely with those countries to ensure that there is a transition plan in place and that investments are targeting priority activities essential for successful transition from SHF financing. So that one of the objectives of this component of the policy is to make sure there is plenty of advanced notice and predictability about this element of transition, and that there is funding to smoothly transition on from SHF. financing. Okay, those were the questions that we received around the eligibility policy. Please could we move to the next slide? We received a few questions relating to the policy on allocation and prioritization. You may have noticed on the last webinar, we talked about allocation letters. And the question is, who will receive the SHF allocation letter? This allocation letter, with information on the funding amount available, will be addressed to the chair of the PCM, serving as the key focal point within government. The chair is expected to share this widely across stakeholders in the multi-sectoral coordination mechanism. And in countries where the chair of the PCM is not the chair of the national coordination mechanism, the chair of the PCM is expected to facilitate handover to this person. Okay, I have one more question here, which is linked to this, which is not on your screens, but I will read the question and the answer. The question is, will the country's allocation be communicated prior to the country program proposal preparation? And yes, the allocation letter I just described will be sent to countries at the beginning of each allocation period, allowing sufficient time prior to the application submission deadline. This provides time for an inclusive process of developing the SHF application in country. Now, when undergoing this process to prepare the application, countries are advised to build on existing and ongoing sector planning activities. And you may also be in a position to start thinking about this already based on the resources that have already been shared in the SHF policies and the application pack. And we'll be sharing more details on the timing of this transition period later in this webinar. Question number 4 on your screens is, what qualitative adjustments were applied in this transition period? And you may remember in the allocation policy, it talks how allocations are derived through a mathematical formula followed by qualitative adjustments. So in this transition period, as per the allocation and prioritization policy, the mathematical formula was used and the adjustments were used with qualitative factors, including potential for impact, past programmatic performance, and additional modifications were made at this stage to reflect the SHF prioritization scheme and anticipated future allocation amounts. Next slide, please. We move to the next slide, please, which is about the co-financing policy. Thank you. So again, there are a few questions on your screen, and there are additional questions which we recently received. And let me begin with one of those. The question is, does the SHF require counterpart funding from the government to implement the SHF in country? And if so, what is the percentage of counterpart funding required? So yes, counterpart funding, referred to as matching contributions in the SHF terminology, forms a key part of the new co-financing policy. And the required percentage of matching contributions is aligned to a country's income level and the SHF eligibility thresholds. And please could I direct you back to the annex of the SHF co-financing policy to find the details of these thresholds and matching contribution amounts. And a reminder that you can find that co-financing policy on the website, and this detail is in the annex. Now, question number 5 on the screen is, how do the co-financing requirements apply to a country that has been supported by GSF for many years? All countries will be required to meet the co-financing requirements. Given that almost all of the first set of countries have a history of global sanitation funding greater than 2 years, these countries will be required to meet the matching contribution aligned to income level and eligibility as per the co-financing policy. In addition, all countries will be required to further develop wash accounts that disaggregate water supply data from sanitation and hygiene and enable financial data to be accurately reported and tracked. Now, we received another question around developing these wash accounts. The question was, what if the country does not yet have a wash account or the existing capacity to develop this? So the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund recognizes that some countries are yet to develop wash accounts or an equivalent way of tracking sector expenditure. Therefore, development of such wash accounts should be included as an activity in the application in years 1 and 2. And in the next question, number 6, on the screen, we find some more detail relating to this. So number 6 on the screen was, meeting co-financing requirements will demand heavy processes and substantial consideration of economic as well as legal and other complex political aspects. What assistance can be expected from the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund? The Sanitation and Hygiene Fund recognizes the effort and careful planning needed to implement these new co-financing requirements. Countries may request financial support as part of the application to develop wash accounts. For the purposes of budgeting in your application, it's recommended to include a budget in the range of 50 to 100K per year, depending on the size of the country, for 2 years to generate these wash accounts. The SHF team will engage separately with each country on the matching requirements and how these can be met. And we will also facilitate engagement with technical support regarding developing wash accounts, for example, with the WHO team who can work with countries on the track fill methodology. Next slide, please. This question is also around co-financing. SHF's priority countries are mainly low-income countries. What would happen if a recipient country fails to meet its funding obligation? So for more information on what happens in this situation, please again refer to the co-financing policy where this is spelt out. The co-financing requirements are designed to take into account a country's income level. They will be closely monitored and reported on an annual basis to the SHF board. Countries will comply with routine monitoring to ensure that these agreed upon co-financing requirements are being met. And in cases where countries are determined to be non-compliant, there are a range of measures that may be taken by the Secretariat. You can see these on your screen here. They include suspension or reduction of grant disbursements, a decreased allocation amount in a subsequent allocation period, or even ineligibility should political will or financial commitment to make responsible efforts to meet these co-financing requirements be completely lacking. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide on the policies, and this is a few questions relating to the fragility policy. Are any of the 11 applicant countries considered fragile by SHF? So again, here I'd refer you back to the fragility policy to see how this determination is done. But the SHF classifies countries as fragile using 3 different sources of data. You can see this in the box on the right-hand side. The determinations are made according to the number of times any country appears on these different lists of fragility. And for the 11 countries that are invited to apply during this transition round, Ethiopia and Eritrea are considered to be level 2 fragility. No countries are categorized as a level 1 fragile country. During one of the last webinars, we had a question, what if only parts of my country are fragile? Now, regardless of whether SHF classifies a country as fragile, tailored responses to each specific country context will be needed, founded on the principle of leave no one behind. The SHF anticipates supporting countries to take responsible action where populations are at greatest risk of neglect and suffering. That often means that for those countries with fragile geographic areas, due consideration will be needed when designing the interventions and planning appropriate implementation strategies. The SHF recognizes that for countries facing fragility challenges in some regions, the programming of funds may require particular targeting to areas free of unrest. Next slide, please. Now, we had some questions around the timing of this transition period. So here is a reminder of the projected timelines during the transition period. In the coming months, starting on the left of your screen, in the coming months, countries will be invited to apply, and following a recommendation from the independent review team, they would then move into a 2-year implementation cycle. Looking ahead to next year, to 2021, we expect the first full allocation round for the SHF to begin around the middle of the year, with a call for applications moving towards signing in new grants for implementation from 2022. Next slide, please. Now, looking at that slide which was presented during the webinars, there was a question asked, will there be a funding or operational gap between the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund and current Global Sanitation Fund grants? This transition period is being designed to avoid any funding or operational gap between the current GSF grant and new grants that may be approved under the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. However, the timelines are tight, and a successful transition without delays will depend on many factors. If a country submits an incomplete application, or if the independent review team recommends a re-review of outstanding issues, there may be a funding and operational gap. Question 11, the successful transformation from WSSCC to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund will depend very much on effective engagement and buy-in from recipient governments. How are you preparing them? So yes, government leadership is indeed central to the success of this new operating model. And the purpose of this transition period is to give time for this transition to take place in an effective manner prior to the launch of the SHF and the first full allocation period. High-level communication is already underway between the Executive Chair of WSSCC and ministers in a number of your countries, including engaging them in the formal launch of the SHF plan for next month. From where you're sitting and where you see more engagement with high-level government is necessary, please do contact regional managers. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the final slide relating to transition timelines. And at the end of this, I will hand over to Carolien to talk about elements of the application pack. But there was a question to go over the projected timeline in some more detail. So you see here on the screen the steps that we're moving through now in 2020. So we're reaching the end of this orientation series and moving towards the call for applications step. This is then followed by the period of application development with in-country dialogue and prioritization for SHF support based on your national plans and policies. We then have the independent review step, where applications are assessed for technical soundness, feasibility, and resolution of outstanding issues. And we then move into grant making and finally grant signing. Now, another question was, when will these allocation letters be sent to countries? So we are awaiting the arrival of Dominic O'Neill, who will become the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund's first executive director. The official information on allocations will come from him. Dominic is due to start on September the 1st, And so we can expect this communication shortly afterwards. And the allocation letter will also include the application submission deadline. Okay, with that, let me hand over the mic to Carolien to begin the questions relating to the application pack. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I will do my best to stick to the same rhythm for the translator. But if I veer off, then please give me a sign, Pascal. Next slide, please, Bob. So I will take you through a few questions that are all related to the programmatic guidelines and information on what we would or would not fund. So the first question, question 13, is where do I find information on what the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund will and will not fund? The programmatic guidelines, which, like James said, are now available through a link for you, present a summary of the normative guidance for the sector, focusing strongly on the WHO's guidance from the Sanitation and Hygiene, Sanitation and Health guidelines, but also beyond that, and provide a lot of information on additional resources and guidance available. This is arranged, the guidelines are arranged according to the 4 strategic objectives of the SHF strategy, and also touch on all the enablers. Under each of the objectives, there is a section called Funding Areas and Limitations. Information on those areas, these sections provide information on those areas that we will and will not fund. And Table 1 in Section 1 of the guidelines also provides a summary of that information. So the second question is around do applications, or the question 14, is do applications need to propose activities under each strategic objective? The Sanitation and Hygiene Fund does not prescribe a distribution of proposed interventions across strategic objectives. There is, however, an expectation for a reasonable balance across the various objectives. Yes, yet this is contingent on your country context, on the sector landscape, on existing funding gaps, and on programmatic priorities. It is thus important to present a clear rationale to describe how priority interventions were selected for SHF support. And the template helps you to go through that rationale. The SHF does encourage countries to focus on systems development to best prepare for scaling up service provision and to ensure sustainability, particularly in this first transition round. These elements can largely be addressed under the relevant strategic objectives, and you will see that once you go through the strategic objectives and the descriptions of the strategic actions, and addressing the enablers as needed, but not disproportionately. Then we received later on a few other questions to do with the programmatic guidelines that we did not include in the slide, but that I will go through as well. The first question, how will the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund use experience of market-based sanitation and encourage entry and growth of sanitation and hygiene private sector? The Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strongly encourages engagement with the private sector. The country's application should be informed by the national strategy and by a situational analysis, where this analysis indicates that the private sector can play a key role to advance national targets. This engagement should be prioritized in the application in terms of the service provision models and the roles proposed. Concurrent with the transition periods, the SHF will also be developing its strategies to engage with key global and in-country partners from the private sector. So in the future, the SHF hopes to develop different models of development financing, including, for example, blended financing models with private sector engagement at a higher level. This so that in future we may be able to propose options to you beyond grant funds as we are at the moment. The second question, will the SHF be flexible in terms of fund utilization? For example, can a country provide smart subsidies in order to be able to support the most vulnerable? Here I refer you back to the programmatic guidelines, and in particular to strategic objective 1, and under that strategic action 1.3, which is all about support to the most vulnerable. The SHF respects the national sanitation policy framework in each country, including approaches on subsidies, incentives, or other social safety nets to support marginalized and vulnerable populations. Where such a pro-poor framework does not yet exist, or where it needs refinement, this can also be prioritized as part of the system's strengthening elements in the country application. And like I said, more information can be found under strategic action 1.3. Next question. Since the most vulnerable communities may also lack access to water supply, will provision of support for water supply in certain cases to enable practice of sanitation and hygiene be allowed? So, as per the what we will and will not fund information in the guidelines, the SHF will not invest in water supply activities at the household level. We will, under certain conditions, invest in water supply as part of washing schools and healthcare facilities. Where the SHF investment intends to target geographic areas where there is insufficient water supply for sanitation and hygiene, the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund investment should be used to leverage co-investments from domestic or other sources for water supply components. And while we will not invest in water supply for households, linked to the current COVID situation, we can discuss situations where water supply for communities in order to be able, for example, to have public hand washing stations in place can be considered. Last question under this slide. My country is now a member of the Sanitation and Water for All, SWA, partnership. How should the SHF application link to the SWA frameworks? In fact, the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund application template is designed to encourage this alignment with the SWA frameworks. Applicants are requested to list any high-level commitments made to the SWA and to use the SWA building block framework to present a situational analysis. Countries are encouraged to include in their applications activities to strengthen elements of this framework, including mechanisms for improving accountability. Okay, next slide, please. Question 15 was pertaining to COVID. In my country, the WASH sector is focusing on the COVID-19 response. Can we use SHF investments for this? The answer is yes, as long as investments are aligned with the national COVID-19 preparedness, response, and prevention plans and respect the guidance provided in the programmatic guidelines. You will find that in the guidelines we have specifically addressed the COVID-19 situation. Question 16. Due to COVID-19, it may be difficult to implement activities. How should this be managed in the application? The pandemic is now part of the context in the short and medium term, and you should assume it will impact on activities throughout the 2-year duration of the application. You should plan activities on the basis of what is possible during the COVID-19 situation and not as if this was pre-COVID-19 times. In the risk and mitigation section, we ask you to address risks that may arise if the pandemic worsens in your country. Next slide, please. In fact, this is where I will hand over. No, sorry, I will still do this slide. Does the SHF provide technical or financial support for the application development? The development of the SHF application is a country-led process, building on existing national plans, roadmaps, assessments, etc. It is very important that this process be led by the responsible government entities and the relevant country stakeholders. The SHF does understand that additional support to coordinate the process may be needed. If the contracting becomes challenging, the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund regional managers are available to help procure necessary consultant support. But preference will be to identify national expertise rather than sources internationally. And this is obviously also very relevant because under COVID times we are restricted around in terms of international travel, etc. Next question, 18. It sounds as if there would be only one application per country. Is that correct? Yes, there will be only one application submitted per country. Question 19. Are there requirements related to the selection of the primary recipient? An important step during application development is the nomination of the primary recipient, overseen by the multi-sectoral coordinating mechanism. While government channels are the preferred means of funding, the selection will depend on each particular country context. If not already in place, a conflict of interest policy should be adopted to ensure the selection process is fair and transparent and free from any perceived or actual conflict of interest. It is envisaged that a consultative process be undertaken to identify the appropriate primary recipient, and the SHF will request that the meeting minutes be shared as evidence of such an impartial process. In addition, and at the start of the grant-making stage, a Sanitation Hygiene Fund capacity assessment will be conducted. With the findings from this assessment, the SHF will then either approve the nominated primary recipient or ask that alternative arrangements be proposed. The last slide I will next slide, Bob. The last slide I will deal with, and then we will move to Sarah. Question 20. There is mention of a performance framework in the application pack, yet no template has been provided. As explained in the application guidelines, each SHF grant will include an associated performance framework. At the application stage, the applicant proposes the targets and indicators to use to measure performance under each of the objectives selected for SHF support. This is to give us a sense of in what extent possible these indicators can be aligned to national monitoring systems to reduce the country's reporting burden. However, the SHF also needs to ensure consistency in the way we monitor. So during the grant making stage, the SHF performance framework will be finalized to align to a set of standard SHF performance indicators, which will be then shared with countries. And if we will have this performance framework available for you earlier, we will share it earlier already. Question 21, when can we expect the budget template and the guidance? The budget template and budget guidelines will be shared with the applicant countries later this month, and so still before you will receive your allocation letter. And a further orientation session will be organized for stakeholders working on the application budget. At this point, I hand over to Sarah, who will take the next batch of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolien. So we've got 3 more slides to work through the remaining questions. We're now on slide 17. So this still pertains to the application guidelines, and in particular, information around the multi-sectoral coordination mechanisms. So question number 22. Is there guidance on setting up or operating the MCM? Will the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund support countries with guidelines on the formation or terms of reference for the new multi-sectoral coordination mechanism? So the response to this is that the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund expects countries to use and strengthen existing national coordination structures. And these bodies will already have terms of reference in place. Yet the application guidelines do provide information on the role required of the MCM for the purposes of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund processes. And this information can be found in Annex 3 to the application guidelines. And in fact, funding from SHF can be requested to help evolve or strengthen this mechanism over time. This is possible under the enabler strengthening partnerships. Question 23. For country governments, how will the point of contact be decided, especially where there are more than one nodal ministries for the wash sector? So we consider the chair of the existing national coordination mechanism as the point of contact for the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund application process. You recall from an earlier point that James made, that's who will receive the allocation letter from the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. In countries where multiple ministries are involved in the delivery of the sanitation and hygiene services, there are, of course, various options for fund management. A country may choose to make the Ministry of Finance and Planning, or equivalent, the primary recipient, and designate other line ministries as secondary recipients. Alternatively, the line ministry that will itself be delivering most of the activities under the grant may be nominated as the primary recipient. The application template, in fact, requests information on the institutional arrangements to help you think through and to rationalize which entity would make the best choice to serve in this capacity as primary recipient. Next slide, please. So these questions relate to the independent review step. And question 24 is, who are the members of the independent review team? So this is the team of impartial technical experts, and they bring significant and demonstrated expertise in their fields, ensuring that the group is sufficiently equipped to review all of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund applications for technical soundness and implementation feasibility. It's important to note that members serve in their personal and technical capacities without respect to professional or institutional affiliation, and do not represent their employer, government, or any other entity. Question 25, how will the applications be reviewed? The independent review team will be oriented to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund strategy and will apply a set of review criteria when assessing the applications submitted. These are provided in Annex 4 to the application guidelines, and they include elements of technical soundness, feasibility, sustainability, value for money, all aligned to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund Programmatic Guidelines and normative guidance, of course. The IRT will consider how likely the proposed activities and SHF investment will achieve the intended results and make a strategic contribution to the country's sanitation and hygiene sector. Before moving on to the next slide, a couple other questions came in. The first being, what is the process for independent review of performance by the primary recipient and other partners? And this relates most to implementation. So once the grant is approved and signed, there will be the use of an independent country monitoring agent, or CMA. The role of the CMA is in some way similar to the role of the country program monitor under the Global Sanitation Fund, or the local fiduciary agent under the Global Fund mode. And one of the first tasks of the CMA will be to conduct the capacity assessment of the nominated primary recipient. This was also touched upon earlier. Information about this step is also included in an annex to the application guidelines. I believe it's Annex 5. Another question received was, how does the performance-based funding mechanism work? So the disbursement decisions against the approved grants, and in fact the determination of future allocations, are both tied to performance. As Carolien explained, each SHF grant will include a performance framework to outline the expected outcomes, targets, and indicators associated with the interventions supported by the fund. Based on reporting by the primary recipient, in line with this performance framework and the grant budget, the Secretariat will make its disbursement decisions. The reports by the country monitoring agent, as well as other outcome survey or programmatic evaluations, will serve as supporting documentation for the Secretariat decision-making process. And lastly, a question about a procedures or operations manual. Will the SHF develop an operation manual to facilitate the implementation of the program following the policies so far received? And the answer is yes. The fund will issue a Sanitation and Hygiene Fund operations manual. It's under development right now, and we hope to be in a position to share that with primary recipients and implementing partners later in this year. This resource will include details around the grant making and grant implementation process of the fund. Next slide. And I realize we're at time, so I will be very quick with this one. The last question that we have here on the slide, can we provide feedback on how the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund can improve communications to countries and the application pack ahead of a future round? And how can I share this with you? So the fund strongly encourages applicant countries, development partners, and other stakeholders to provide feedback on the materials developed for this transition period. In fact, we're in the process of designing what we term a learning agenda to document the inputs from a range of sector partners during the coming months to inform a final version of the application pack ahead of the first full round of applications expected in 2021. So we are definitely in learning mode with all of you and hope that you will continue to engage with us with your questions, your feedback, any commentaries, and please do this through the regional managers. With that, I'll hand it back to James, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah and Carolien, and thank you to everybody who's been joining this webinar series today and previously also. The recordings of these webinars and these slides will be made available to you. I hope that the question and answer format today was informative. These questions will now go into a frequently asked questions document, and that will be circulated to you. Please do keep asking questions. In fact, we will leave the chat box open for another 10 minutes after we finish this presentation, in case you'd like to add any more questions right away, else they could come in by email. As Carolien mentioned, please keep an eye out for future webinars. We will be organizing one specifically around budget, template, and guidance for those of you who will be working on that elements of the application. And looking further into the year, we very much look forward to receiving your first applications to the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. With that, let me wish you all a very good day and bring the webinar to a close. Thank you very much, everybody.